I thought that just at the beginning, it might be handy if I just talked about the anatomy situation, the neurology situation, just a little bit, just to make sure that we are on the same page. Does that sound okay?
That sounds excellent.
Yeah, so we're talking about bivalves and sentience, of course. When people claim that oysters and clams and other bivalves are non-sentient, I notice that one thing they often do is assert that as a fact without any evidence. Or, alternatively, when people make that claim and they do try to support it with evidence, they get the science wrong. And that includes people sometimes using quite a lot of scientific terminology, which can give the impression that they know what they're talking about, but in fact they don't. The most convincing argument I've ever heard against bivalve sentience was something I heard on an old comment thread the other day. And every other word this person used was straight out of a biology textbook. I mean, I'm a PhD, but I try not to use technical language, more than is necessary, because there's no point. But this person was talking in an incredibly technical manner, and yet the actual claim they were making, factual assertion they made, to do with the cerebral ganglion was completely wrong. So, you've got to be very careful when you're dealing with this topic, if you're not well versed in it, that people can sound like they know what they're talking about, and in fact they don't. So, just trying to remember what the person said. It was, it's to do with the cerebral ganglion. So, anyway, I went and looked up the actual definition, the dictionary definition of the word brain. The Oxford English Dictionary definition of the word brain, it's the convoluted mass of nervous substance, in other words, neurons, etc., is contained in the skull. And of course that definition works fine for human beings and other mammals and for birds and for fish, but what happens when you've got a brain which doesn't have a skull around it? Well, it's still a brain, but the word brain no longer gets used for it, and that's the situation we've got with bivalves. They've got a brain. Every bivalve has got anatomical feature, which is a brain, a big bunch of neurons which controls things. It does everything that a brain does, sending out signals, getting back signals, making decisions. But it doesn't get the label brain. It gets called a cerebral ganglion. So when people say, and I'm sure you've come across this, people say bivalves don't have brains or oysters don't have brains, it's very misleading, because it implies that they're like a human being or a dog or a mouse with the head amputated. It's like a headless person walking around. But, or that they're a headless, brainless version of an animal, and it's not a proper animal. That's just not true. They've got a skull-less brain, a non-cephalic brain, consisting of neurons, just like any other brain, and it's called a cerebral ganglion. Or sometimes it's known as a cerebro-pleural ganglion, which is when it's combined with pleural ganglion, which supplies nerves to the mantle cavity. But cerebral ganglion is the underlying term. And
may I jot in and just mention, from a vegan's point of view, like vegans who hold that position clearly are not vegan. That's a species' point of view to discriminate based on a lack of features on another species just because they're not like us. Therefore justify, rights violations towards that species. So clearly not a pro-animal rights position. That's all I want to mention.
Yeah, I absolutely agree, because obviously we happen to have a brain with a skull around it. So what's happened is that we've sort of loaded the dice in our own favour. We've sort of made it a rule that creatures have got to be as much like human beings as possible in order for us to care about them. The cerebral ganglion basically means the brain ganglion. The word cerebral means brain. So, so it's different from a pedal ganglion, which operates the foot. It's not the visceral ganglion, which is to do with digestion. It's the cerebral ganglion, the brain ganglion. And it's the bit that's the brain. It does what a brain does. And it's made out of neurons, just like a human brain is made out of neurons. And it's got the job of connecting up the other bits, and it makes the decisions and all the rest of it. Another interesting example is that of lobsters, and I know that I've talked to you a little bit about that before. The British government is no friend of non-human animals, like most governments. It subsidises animal agriculture and animal experiments, etc. But even the British government has now officially recognised, from 2021 onwards, having commissioned their own in-depth scientific research, that crabs and lobsters are sentient. And yet the interesting thing about lobsters is, guess what? They haven't got quote-unquote brains. They've got cerebral ganglia instead. And lobsters have got heads, but there's no brain inside them. Brain, aka cerebral ganglion, is outside the skull. It's still there in the same way that it's still there with oysters and clams, but it's not inside the skull. And yet, lobsters are sentient. And that's not an animal rights position, that's a government position. And brains are not needed for sentience, just cerebral neurons operating as a brain, which brings in the signals and perceives things, and, that's the sort of central processing unit. That's still there. It just doesn't get called a brain. And then another major error, which ties into these, is that people tend to refer to the ganglia of bivalves, including the cerebral ganglia, which is their brain, as nerve ganglia, which I'm sure you've heard. And that's very misleading, because it's not just nerves like we would have on the end of our finger, sensory nerves that pick up pain, like if you prick your finger. It's also nerves in the sense of neurons and brain matter. So they do have non-brain ganglia, in other words, non-cerebral ganglia, such as the visceral ganglion, which I've already mentioned. And human beings have got neurons in their gut as well to help our gut contract at the right times, etc. But those neurons are specialized. They're tied to a specific little task. They're not control centers, like a brain or a cerebral ganglia. And strictly speaking, cerebral ganglia shouldn't necessarily be called ganglia, because ganglia normally means neurons in the peripheral nervous system, which doesn't apply with bivalves, because their cerebral ganglion is in fact acting as a brain, which is a central nervous system feature, not a peripheral nervous system feature. Which is why some scientists speak of bivalve central nervous system ganglia. They use the word central nervous system in relation to it. But for most of us, the language just trips us up, because it's all designed to describe human beings and other cephalous animals. It's speciesist, as you mentioned. And the language very often falls apart when it's called upon to describe oysters or lobsters, because the terminology which we're using wasn't designed to describe those branches of the animal kingdom. I've got a couple of other little anatomy points I'd like to cover. When people say bivalves don't have brains, they've just got nerve ganglia, as if an oyster has got nerves, like a finger has got nerves, but no brain to connect those nerves to, they're doubly wrong, because one of those ganglia is a non-cephalous brain, a brain outside a skull, and they're also gone wrong because bivalves have got neurons, not just sensory nerves. So it's this kind of misunderstanding which leads people to jump into these false comparisons, which I'm sure you've come across. For example, like they'll say bivalve is comparable to a severed finger because there's nerves and no brain. Well, no, it isn't. It isn't comparable to that at all, because yes, bivalves have got sensory nerves, the same as human beings have got sensory nerves, but they've also got a control center, which a severed finger doesn't have. And they don't have a cerebral ganglion acting as a control unit. And if they did, is the really funny thing, if they did, then a severed finger, if it had a blood supply and could survive, it would be able to, make its way around and detect danger and hide from danger and dig under stuff and get into fights with other severed fingers, like bivalves sometimes get into fights with other bivalves. And the severed finger obviously can't do any of these things because it doesn't have a central processing unit. It doesn't have any version of a brain. If you tap below your knee and your leg shoots out, that takes around 3 or 4 neurons in order to accomplish it. It's motor neurons. Whereas if you add up the number of neurons which bivalves have got, it's in the thousands.
Yeah,
It's,
they got
6
at
or 7.
least. Yeah, at least. Let me just. Yeah, it was around 6,000 approximately.
The thing about the severed fingers is that same kind of principle also applies to tumours. I mean, for one thing, it's incredibly unusual for a tumour to contain any neurons. They don't tend to, but very occasionally it can happen. For example, if you've got conjoined twins, I'm talking about human development, of course, or potentially non-human, I suppose. But if you've got a human being who's a conjoined twin, and they've developed reasonably okay, hopefully fine, but they've got an undeveloped conjoined twin still attached to them. That twin may not have developed properly at all, and so they could potentially have some neurons in there, maybe even some brain neurons, the beginnings of a brain. But it's nightmarish if you ever look into this. You probably shouldn't look into it. Nobody should. It's horrible. But there's like a single tooth in there, and there's like little bits of body part all sort of mangled up. It's nightmarish. And the thing is, either there won't be any awareness in there because the cerebral ganglia just haven't got going, or the brain has got going in there. There is a functioning brain of sorts, maybe a minimal brain, but it's still acting as a brain, and it's stuck there inside a tumour. Now, if you think about it, that's absolutely something out of hell. If you were a consciousness that was actually stuck inside this tumour, can you imagine? So, and being trapped in there with the type of neuronal constructions which could sustain awareness, which would make would make it in charge of the tumour. It's the brain of the tumour. That consciousness would be trapped in that terrible existence, and in those incredibly rare circumstances, if it arose, then the kindest thing to do would be to kill the tumour for its own sake, because otherwise you're prolonging this incredibly miserable, nightmarish existence for this poor being who's trapped in there. But that doesn't mean that it's okay to kill bivalves, because they are living a proper life for a bivalve. They're not a human consciousness trapped inside a tumour, they're an animal. And they're capable of living an animal life. So let them live their animal life in the same way that you should let a fish live a fish life or a chicken live a chicken life. And so, yeah, the tumour argument just doesn't have any validity at all. One thing I forgot to mention, which is really important, maybe the most important thing of all, we have to think about what the moral consequences are if we behave as if bivalves are non-sentient, and then we find out that they are. People used to think that fish are non-sentient, but now we know that they are. Bivalves are typically killed by being steamed to death. If you steam a creature to death or boil a creature to death, a sentient creature to death, then that is truly horrific. You're torturing them to death, and that's in huge numbers because they're so small, relatively speaking, and that means that lots of them get killed per amount of food. So, whilst my main point is that they are sentient, my subsidiary point is that even if you think there's only a 1 in 10 chance or 1 in 50 chance or whatever that they're sentient, why take that chance? Why would you gamble on the possibility that you are inflicting a torturous death on a sentient being? But yeah, the point I was going to just bring up is this concept I've come across, and it seems to come ultimately from Tom Regan, who was an animal rights philosopher. And I've heard bits of what he's said, and, on the whole, he seems to be good. But one of the theories he puts forward wasn't very good, it wasn't very valid, and it's been misused since then, so it's got even worse. And that is the idea that some creatures lead a quote-unquote trivial existence.
Completely subjective.
Yeah, it is subjective. The idea seems to be that, unless an animal is living some kind of complex life in a complex social structure, etc., then they don't deserve moral consideration. And
oh my goodness!
So
is that like a Nazi?
Yeah. Well, yeah, exactly. I mean, that's the obvious implication of that, because, what did the Nazis do with people who have mental handicaps, who could only live a very simple existence, who didn't have complexities necessarily in the way they express themselves? Maybe some of them couldn't use language. But does that mean it was okay to kill people? Or of course it wouldn't. We wouldn't do that to human beings. And so if we wouldn't do that to human beings, then why should we do it to non-human beings? It's simply wrong to base our consideration of the lives and the welfare of other beings on how intelligent they are. Intelligence doesn't have anything to do with sentience. It doesn't have anything to do with awareness. A chess champion, might have an IQ of 100 70, and the same way somebody who's a very good artist, they might have a far more complex brain than I've got, a complex mind, but that doesn't mean that I can't suffer.
Yeah, exactly.
And
It's a
so
psychopathic point of view, in my opinion. Like, it's a completely selfish, unempathetic point of view, to the extent it's like, okay, well, you don't matter because you lack being me, basically.
yeah, you lack being me. Wow. Yeah, they lack being me. Wow. Yeah, that is it. That is it.